The chambermaid is gone. The announcement barely registered at first. Alpha King Kaelor Vyre continued reviewing treaty documents spread across the war table, while nobles argued loudly around him about border disputes and succession alliances. Outside the council chamber, thunder rolled across the capital. Inside, nobody cared about servants disappearing. Not during negotiation season. Kaelor signed another document without looking up. Replace her. The head servant hesitated near the doorway. My king. She vanished after cleaning your private chambers. That finally earned a pause. Kaelor lifted his eyes slowly. The servant swallowed nervously beneath the attention. What was her name? Kaelor asked. Lyra. A brief silence followed, because he remembered her. Not well, but enough. Quiet girl, always worked late, never spoke unless addressed directly. She kept her dark hair tied back neatly while cleaning the royal floor, and lowered her eyes whenever nobles passed. Kaelor remembered seeing her near the library corridors, late at night, carrying fresh linens once. And once, only once, he remembered her laughing softly with another servant in the winter kitchens, before immediately falling silent when she noticed him nearby. Small memories, forgettable ones. The council doors suddenly opened behind him. Your Majesty, a northern advisor interrupted urgently. The western delegates demand immediate revision of the succession agreements. The room erupted again instantly. Another argument, another political disaster waiting for his attention. Kaelor exhaled quietly before looking back toward the servant near the door. Search the servant quarters, he ordered flatly. Question the guards assigned to the royal wing. Yes, Your Majesty. Then Kaelor returned to the treaty documents, and the moment passed. The search lasted 3 days. No signs of forced entry, no blood, no body, no scent trail. Even the palace wolves could follow beyond the eastern servant halls. By the 4th day, the rumors started. She stole jewelry from the noble chambers. She ran away with smugglers. She was hiding debts. Every version spread quickly through the palace. Then Lady Maurice arrived with the final explanation. The girl panicked after theft was discovered, Maris said smoothly before the royal council. Servants like that disappear often. Kaelor barely looked up during the report. Too many larger problems demanded attention. Border pressure, council instability, nobles demanding he choose a mate before the next winter summit. One servant disappearing beneath palace politics felt insignificant compared to everything else. Maurice noticed his indifference immediately. She clearly fled the kingdom by now. She continued calmly. Continuing investigation wastes royal resources. Kaelor signed another military order absent-mindedly. Then closed the case. And just like that, the palace stopped searching. The servant quarters emptied her room within the week. Her name disappeared from royal records shortly afterward. Life inside the capital moved on easily. Only one older kitchen servant quietly questioned the story months later. She left her winter cloak behind, the woman whispered once to another maid. No one runs into snow without one. But no one listened, because servants disappeared all the time, or at least that's what the palace told itself, until 7 years later, when a woman long believed forgotten walked back through the kingdom gates carrying the child no one was ever supposed to find. The southern marketplace erupted into panic shortly after noon. Wolves! Merchants abandoned stalls instantly, while guards pushed civilians toward the inner gates. Children cried, horses screamed. Several dark shapes moved near the outer road beyond the fountain square. Rogue wolves. At least that was what the guards believed at first. Archers ready. Steel rang sharply throughout the marketplace as soldiers rushed into formation. Then suddenly, everything stopped, because standing calmly in the center of the chaos was a young boy, no older than 6. Dark hair, silver eyes, and absolutely no fear. A massive gray wolf stood beside him, protectively, while the child rested one small hand against its fur, like this happened every day. The crowd stared in disbelief. One guard lowered his weapon slowly. That wolf isn't attacking him. The boy looked around curiously at the frightened marketplace before speaking softly to the animal beside him. It's too loud here. The wolf immediately settled, obedient, calm. Several older servants watching near the fountain suddenly froze, not because of the wolf, because of the child, or more specifically, the faint silver mark glowing beneath the rolled sleeve of his shirt. Royal blood, the heir mark. One elderly palace maid nearly dropped the basket in her hands. "No," she whispered shakily. Then her eyes lifted higher, toward the woman walking quickly through the crowd behind the child, and the basket finally slipped completely from her fingers. Lyra. The marketplace fell silent around the name. The missing servant stopped walking immediately. 7 years older now. Thinner, harder around the eyes, but unmistakably the same woman who vanished from the royal palace without explanation. The boy looked up at her instantly. "Mother?" Several guards exchanged alarmed looks. "Mother." The elderly servant stared openly now at the child beside Lyra, at his silver eyes, at the glowing royal mark, at the impossible resemblance forming more clearly every second. One guard finally stepped forward carefully. "My lady," he said uncertainly. "That child, who is he?" Lyra answered calmly. "His name is Cassian." That wasn't the answer anyone wanted. The guards already knew it, or at least suspected enough to panic. One soldier hurried immediately toward the palace gates. "Inform the throne hall now." The marketplace exploded into whispers. "The king's mark. She disappeared years ago. That boy looks exactly like—" Lyra ignored all of it. Cassian tugged lightly on her sleeve instead. "Are these bad people?" The question hit harder, because he asked it innocently. Lyra crouched carefully to his level. "No," she said softly. "Just surprised people." Cassian nodded seriously, like that explanation made perfect sense. Then his attention shifted toward the Capitol Palace, towering above the city. "Is that where he lives?" The nearby guards stiffened instantly. Lyra held her son's gaze for one brief moment before answering quietly. "Yes." No one missed what she meant. By the time royal soldiers escorted them toward the palace, the entire capital already buzzed with rumors. A missing servant had returned. And beside her walked a child, carrying the Alpha King's bloodline, openly beneath the afternoon sun. Inside the throne hall, political chaos had already begun before Lyra ever reached the doors. And, for the first time in 7 years, Kaelor Vire was finally about to learn what disappeared with the maid he barely remembered. The throne hall erupted before Lyra even entered it. A hidden heir threatened succession stability. She vanished for 7 years without explanation. How do we know the child is legitimate? Nobles argued loudly across the royal chamber, while council elders demanded immediate investigation. At the center of it all, Alpha King Kaelor Vire sat silently on the throne, listening to chaos rise around him. But his thoughts remained fixed on one thing only: silver eyes. The servant from 7 years ago had returned carrying a child with his face. The massive doors finally opened. Silence spread instantly through the hall. Lyra entered calmly, holding the boy's hand. No expensive clothing, no noble escort, no fear. Cassian looked around curiously at the enormous chamber, while guards lined both walls tensely. "Mother," he whispered quietly, "why are they staring at us?" No one answered, because the resemblance between him and Kaelor grew more impossible to ignore the longer they looked. The same dark hair, the same silver eyes, even the same expression when observing unfamiliar surroundings carefully. Kaelor descended from the throne platform slowly. Every noble watched closely. "You disappeared," he said finally. Lyra met his gaze evenly. "No," she replied calmly. "I was forced to disappear." The room fell silent again. Kaelor's expression sharpened immediately. "Explain." Lyra turned her head slightly. Not toward him, toward Lady Maurice. The noblewoman stiffened instantly beneath the attention, and Kaelor noticed. "7 years ago," Lyra said quietly, "someone discovered I was carrying the king's child." The throne hall exploded into outrage. Maurice rose sharply from her seat. "That's a lie," Lyra continued over her calmly. "I was told if I stayed inside the palace, my baby would not survive the week." Dead silence followed. Even the council stopped speaking. Kaelor slowly turned toward Maurice. Memories suddenly surfaced all at once. Maurice insisting the maid fled after theft. Maurice recommending the investigation end early. Maurice controlling most servant affairs during that period. Too involved, far too involved. Cassian tugged lightly on Lyra's sleeve during the silence. "Mother," he asked softly, "is this the king?" Several nobles looked horrified by the question. Lyra glanced down at him briefly before answering. "Yes." Cassian studied Kaelor curiously for a moment, then blinked once. "You look like me." The statement landed harder than any accusation in the room. Kaelor stared at the boy speechlessly, because hearing it aloud made the truth impossible to emotionally distance from anymore. A royal healer finally stepped forward carefully. "My king," she said quietly. "Permission to verify the child's mark." Kaelor nodded once. The healer approached Cassian slowly. "May I see your wrist, young one?" Cassian looked toward Lyra first. She gave a small nod. Only then did he roll up his sleeve. The silver mark beneath his skin glowed immediately beneath the throne hall light. Ancient royal blood recognition. Undeniable. Real. The healer stepped backward sharply. "The air mark is authentic." Chaos erupted again. Councilmen shouted over one another, while nobles argued across the chamber in panic. But Kaelor barely heard any of it now, because standing beside Lyra was his son, 7 years old, 7 years hidden from him, 7 years gone forever. And suddenly, the servant girl he once barely noticed had become the center of everything he failed to see. The throne hall remained in chaos long after the royal healer confirmed the truth. The succession laws must be reviewed immediately. A servant-born heir cannot simply appear without challenge. This threatens every alliance negotiation currently in progress. Voices crashed against the stone walls endlessly. Kaelor ignored all of them. His attention stayed fixed on the child standing beside Lyra. Cassian, his son. The boy seemed far more interested in the giant wolf carvings decorating the throne pillars than the political disaster unfolding around him, which somehow made everything hurt worse, because he was still innocent enough not to understand what 7 lost years meant. Kaelor stepped closer slowly. Cassian immediately shifted nearer to Lyra instinctively, protective, cautious, not frightened exactly, but unfamiliar. Kaelor noticed immediately, and hated it. "What is your full name?" he asked quietly. Cassian answered without hesitation. "Cassian Vale, not Vire." The realization settled heavily inside the throne room. Kaelor looked toward Lyra. "You never gave him my name." Lyra's expression remained calm. "I didn't know if you deserved it attached to him." Several nobles inhaled sharply at the bluntness. Kaelor didn't react outwardly, because deep down, he knew she had earned the right to say it. Cassian glanced between them curiously. Before asking the question, no one else dared voice aloud. "Are you really my father?" Silence spread instantly. Kaelor lowered himself carefully to the boy's height. "Yes." Cassian studied him thoughtfully for several long seconds. Then came the second question. Then, why didn't you come find us? The throne hall went completely still. Even the nobles stopped speaking. Kaelor felt the weight of every eye in the chamber shift toward him. But the hardest gaze belonged to the child, waiting honestly for an answer. He glanced briefly toward Lyra. She didn't interrupt, didn't rescue him from the moment, because she wanted the truth spoken plainly. Kaelor finally answered quietly. I didn't know you existed. Cassian frowned slightly. Mother said bad people lied to you. Kaelor's eyes lifted slowly toward Maurice, standing pale near the council seats. For the first time in years, the noblewoman looked genuinely afraid. She did, Kaelor admitted. Cassian accepted the answer more easily than the adults in the room. Children often did. The boy's attention shifted again toward the wolves carved into the walls. Can I touch one? A few servants nearly smiled despite the tension. Kaelor stared at him for a moment longer before standing again slowly. Then he turned toward the royal guards. Take Lady Maurice into custody immediately. Shock tore through the hall. Maurice stepped backward instantly. You can't arrest me over accusations from a servant. Kaelor's voice dropped dangerously low. You threatened a woman carrying my heir. That child destabilizes the kingdom. No, Kaelor replied coldly. People like you do. The guards moved toward Maurice immediately. For once, the powerful noblewoman looked small. Cassian watched the scene quietly, before tugging lightly on Lyra's sleeve again. Mother, he whispered, did she make us leave? Lyra looked down at her son briefly, then answered honestly. Yes. Cassian nodded slowly, not angry, just understanding something important. Kaelor watched the exchange silently, and the full weight of it finally settled inside him. His son learned the truth about palace cruelty before learning his father's face. That realization followed him long after the guards dragged Maurice from the throne hall screaming. Lady Maurice's imprisonment shook the palace faster than war rumors ever could. By morning, servants whispered openly through the corridors, while nobles scrambled desperately to distance themselves from her political faction. Forged reports, threats against a pregnant servant, the hidden royal heir. Every scandal spread through the capital at once. And at the center of it all, Kaelor Vire sat alone inside the royal records chamber, reading documents he should have reviewed 7 years earlier. False theft accusations, altered guard reports, missing servant logs. Entire investigations quietly erased beneath Maurice's authority. Kaelor turned another page slowly, then another. Each one made the silence inside the chamber heavier. A knock interrupted eventually. Enter. Lyra stepped inside carefully before closing the door behind her. Kaelor looked up immediately. For a moment, neither spoke. The records between them already explained too much. Finally, Kaelor asked quietly, Where did you go after leaving the palace? Lyra folded her arms lightly. North first, then farther east. After rumors spread, people were searching. Searching for you. Kaelor corrected automatically. Lyra held his gaze evenly. No, she said calmly. Searching for the servant accused of theft. That landed hard because it was true. Kaelor lowered his eyes briefly toward the forged reports scattered across the table. I should have investigated deeper. You should have noticed someone suddenly disappearing after leaving your chambers. Silence followed immediately. Kaelor had no defense. Again, Lyra moved closer to the window overlooking the palace gardens. Cassian was born during winter, she continued quietly. We lived in abandoned trade housing for almost 2 years. Kaelor's chest tightened painfully. You raised him alone. I kept him alive alone. The wording mattered. Kaelor noticed and hated himself for understanding exactly why she chose it. Outside the window, palace wolves crossed the lower courtyard while servants rushed around, preparing evening lanterns. A kingdom continued functioning normally while she survived in hiding, carrying his child. "How did you manage?" he asked finally. Lyra looked toward him again. "I worked where no one asked questions. Healers, farmers, border villages." A pause. People with less power than nobles usually showed more kindness. Kaelor absorbed that silently, because the accusation inside the sentence was deserved, too. A soft knock sounded at the partially open doorway moments later. Cassian peeked inside, curiously. "Mother?" Lyra's expression softened instantly. "Yes, there's a wolf outside following me." Kaelor almost smiled, despite everything. "That means it likes you." Cassian entered the room carefully, then stopped near the massive record table. "So many books," he whispered in awe. Kaelor watched his son closely. The boy carried none of the arrogance palace heirs usually learned young, only curiosity and cautious observation. 7 years outside royal corruption preserved something valuable inside him. Cassian suddenly noticed the scattered reports across the table. "Are those about us?" Kaelor hesitated briefly before answering honestly. "Yes." Cassian frowned thoughtfully. Did bad people really lie this much? The question cut deeper than anger. Kaelor glanced toward the forged royal seals stamped across the papers, then finally admitted quietly, "Yes." Cassian considered that for a moment, before asking the worst question yet. Then why did everyone believe them? Silence filled the chamber completely. Kaelor looked toward Lyra. She said nothing, because some answers deserved to hurt, and for the first time, Kaelor fully understood punishment wasn't losing 7 years. It was knowing he helped make those years necessary. Cassian adapted to palace life faster than anyone expected, not because he trusted it, because he explored it. Every hallway fascinated him. Every suit of armor, every carved wolf statue lining the corridors. The servants quickly learned the young heir wandered constantly whenever Lyra looked away for more than 5 minutes, and somehow, palace wolves kept finding him first. One afternoon, Kaelor discovered Cassian sitting cross-legged inside the western courtyard, feeding scraps of roasted meat to one of the royal wolves beside the fountain. The massive gray beast accepted the offering gently from the child's hands. Completely calm, Kaelor stopped nearby, watching silently. Most adults approached royal wolves carefully. Cassian treated them like oversized hunting dogs. The boy finally noticed him standing there. "Oh," Cassian said casually. "This one likes venison better." Kaelor stepped closer slowly. "That wolf once bit a general for standing too near its food." Cassian frowned slightly at the animal. "You bite people?" The wolf lowered its ears, almost guiltily. Kaelor nearly laughed. Nearly. Cassian studied him quietly for a moment afterward before asking, "Do all kings have wolves?" "Yes." "Do all wolves live in palaces?" "No." Cassian nodded thoughtfully, like he was organizing important information privately inside his head. Then came the real question. Why do nobles hate Mother? Kaelor's expression tightened instantly. Children ask things adults spent years avoiding. "They don't all hate her," he answered carefully. Cassian looked unconvinced. "They stare at her differently. Because she was once a servant. Because nobles preferred forgetting where power actually came from. Because kindness threatened people who built authority through fear." Kaelor thought all of that, but none of it felt fair to place onto a 6-year-old child. Finally, he said quietly, "Some people care too much about status." Cassian scratched gently behind the wolf's ears. "That seems stupid." Kaelor couldn't argue. The courtyard remained peaceful for several minutes afterward, until Cassian suddenly asked another question, without looking up. "Did you love Mother before she left?" Silence hit immediately. Kaelor stared at the boy carefully. Cassian remained focused on the wolf beside him, like he hadn't just shattered years of emotional avoidance with one sentence. "I respected her," Kaelor answered slowly. Cassian looked up instantly. "That's not the same thing." No, it wasn't. Kaelor understood that now better than anyone. The boy stood, suddenly before walking toward the courtyard steps, then paused halfway. "Mother says people notice value too late when they think someone will always stay." Kaelor froze, because those words sounded far too wise for a child his age. "Did she say that recently?" he asked quietly. Cassian nodded. "After the palace meeting." Then he tilted his head curiously. "Is that why you look sad around her?" The question struck harder than accusations from the council ever had. Kaelor watched his son carefully, so observant, so honest. The kind of honesty palace politics usually destroyed early. And suddenly, Kaelor realized something terrifying. Cassian trusted Lyra completely, listened to her, believed her. But when speaking to Kaelor, the boy still sounded cautious, curious, uncertain. Not because he feared him, because trust had never been built between them. And for the first time, Kaelor understood fatherhood wasn't blood. It was time, something he could never fully recover now, no matter how desperately he wanted to. The West Wing remained untouched by royal luxury. Even after Kaelor ordered new chambers, prepared near the royal quarters, Lyra refused to move. "We're comfortable here," she said simply. The statement frustrated half the palace. The West Wing housed servants, healers, and lower-ranking staff. Not royal heirs. Council elders complained constantly. The future heir cannot live among common workers. It damages royal image. The child must be raised properly. Kaelor listened to every complaint in silence, then ignored all of them, because every time he walked through the West Wing, he understood exactly why Lyra stayed. The servants treated Cassian like a child instead of a political asset. No forced etiquette lessons, no calculated noble attention, no whispers about succession during dinner, just warmth. One evening, Kaelor found Cassian asleep beside the kitchen fireplace, while 3 older servants quietly mended his torn shirt nearby. Lyra sat close to him, folding clean laundry. Simple domestic peace, something the royal chambers never truly held. One servant noticed Kaelor first, and immediately stood nervously. "My king." Kaelor raised one hand gently. "Stay seated." The older woman hesitated before obeying slowly. Kaelor looked toward the shirt being repaired. It was torn climbing trees. Lyra explained calmly, without looking up. Cassian stirred slightly in his sleep beside the fire. "He climbed the southern wall yesterday, too," one servant added, with a faint smile. Kaelor almost responded automatically, like a father listening to ordinary childhood complaints. The realization unsettled him unexpectedly, because these small moments should have belonged to him years ago. Instead, strangers witnessed them first. Kaelor stepped closer toward Lyra quietly. "You still don't trust this palace." Lyra folded another shirt carefully. "No," she answered honestly. The servants exchanged awkward looks before quietly leaving the room, one by one. Soon only the fire crackling softly beside Cassian filled the silence. Kaelor lowered his voice. "I removed the people responsible." "You removed one woman," Lyra corrected calmly. "The palace itself still functions exactly the same." Kaelor frowned slightly. "You think nothing changed?" "I think powerful people ignored a servant disappearing because it was convenient." That answer settled heavily between them, because once again, she wasn't wrong. Kaelor looked around the modest West Wing carefully. Simple furniture, plain walls, no royal decorations, and yet Cassian laughed more here than anywhere else inside the palace. "You could have demanded anything after returning," Kaelor said quietly. "Status, wealth, influence. Lyra finally looked toward him directly. "I wanted safety," she replied. A pause. "You're the one who keeps offering everything except that." The words struck cleanly. Not shouted, not emotional, just honest. Kaelor exhaled slowly, before glancing toward the sleeping child beside the fire. Cassian had one hand curled loosely around the edge of Lyra's sleeve, even while asleep. Instinctive, protective, like some part of him still feared waking up alone. Kaelor noticed immediately, and something inside him twisted painfully. "He still worries you'll disappear," he said softly. Lyra's expression shifted briefly, then smoothed again. "For years," she admitted quietly, "we slept in places where leaving quickly kept us alive." Silence followed. Kaelor looked at his son again. A prince of the kingdom, raised hiding from it instead. Finally, he spoke the truth he should have admitted long ago. "I failed both of you." Lyra held his gaze steadily across the firelight, then answered with devastating calm, "Yes." Nothing in the room argued otherwise. The royal assembly filled before sunrise. Nobles packed the throne hall in formal colors, while military officials lined the lower platforms beneath towering silver banners. Everyone expected another succession announcement, or, perhaps new, laws regarding the hidden heir. Instead, Kaelor Vire arrived, carrying a stack of sealed records beneath one arm. The room quieted immediately. Lyra stood near the side balcony beside Cassian, while servants whispered nervously behind them. Cassian looked fascinated by the crowd. Lyra looked prepared for war. Kaelor stopped at the center platform slowly, then spoke without ceremony. 7 years ago, a servant disappeared from this palace, carrying the crown's heir. Silence spread instantly. Kaelor placed the documents onto the throne table, one by one. Her disappearance was not voluntary. Murmurs erupted. Kaelor continued coldly. Royal reports were falsified. Investigations were manipulated. Threats were made against both mother and unborn child. Several nobles visibly paled. Because now, this wasn't rumor anymore. It was official royal acknowledgement. Kaelor lifted one forged report into the air. Lady Maurice used noble authority to erase a servant she considered inconvenient. The doors behind the throne hall opened sharply. Maurice entered in chains. Gasps exploded across the chamber instantly. The once powerful noblewoman looked furious instead of ashamed. "This is political theater," she shouted. "You're humiliating noble houses over one servant." Kaelor's expression never changed. "One servant." His voice echoed sharply through the hall. "You threatened the life of my unborn son because his mother lacked status." Maurice laughed bitterly. "She cleaned your chambers. She wasn't fit to stand beside royalty." Cassian looked toward Lyra quietly. "Why does she keep saying that?" Lyra rested one calming hand against his shoulder. Kaelor descended the platform slowly toward Maurice. Every noble watched carefully. "You believed power gave you the right to decide whose life mattered," he said coldly. Maurice lifted her chin defiantly. "I protected the kingdom." "No," Kaelor replied. "You protected a hierarchy terrified of humanity." The silence afterward felt enormous. Kaelor turned toward the assembly. "From this day forward, no servant accusation, imprisonment, or disappearance may occur without direct royal investigation." Shock spread instantly among the nobles, because everyone understood what this meant. Less unchecked authority, less silence, less ability to erase inconvenient people quietly. One council elder stepped forward carefully. "My king, restructuring servant protections this aggressively may weaken noble cooperation." Kaelor's gaze sharpened immediately. "Then perhaps noble cooperation deserves weakening." The statement hit the room like thunder. Several servants standing near the walls lowered their heads quickly, hiding emotion, because no ruler had ever publicly defended palace workers like this before. Kalor finally looked toward Lyra across the hall. This kingdom failed people it considered beneath notice, he declared. His eyes moved briefly toward Cassian beside her. That failure ends now, for the first time since returning. The throne hall didn't look at Lyra like a scandal. It looked at her like proof. Proof the palace ignored suffering until it became impossible to hide anymore. Maurice stared around the chamber desperately. No support came. No noble defended her openly now, because survival inside royal politics depended on sensing power shifts early. And today, the entire kingdom shifted. Cassian tugged lightly on Lyra's sleeve afterward. "Mother? Yes. Does this mean bad people can't make others disappear anymore?" Lyra looked toward Kalor, standing alone at the center of the throne hall, then answered quietly, "It means someone finally decided they shouldn't." And somehow, that felt closer to justice than revenge ever could. The palace gardens became Cassian's favorite place within weeks. Not the throne hall, not the training yards, not the royal libraries nobles insisted heirs should admire. The gardens, because the wolves wandered there freely during the evenings, and because Kalor eventually started joining him there without guards. At first the meetings felt awkward, careful, like both of them feared saying the wrong thing. Cassian still called him "Your Majesty," half the time, out of habit picked up from servants. Every time it happened, Kalor felt the distance between them sharply, but slowly. Small things changed. One evening, Kalor found Cassian attempting to climb the old stone fountain near the western hedges, while two young wolves circled below excitedly. "You're going to fall," Kalor warned calmly. Cassian grinned immediately. "No, I'm not." He slipped 2 seconds later. Kalor caught him before he hit the ground. The wolves barked excitedly around them, while Cassian burst into laughter. Kalor stared at him in mild disbelief. "You nearly cracked your head open." "But I didn't." That confidence sounded painfully familiar. Kalor finally shook his head once. "You argue exactly like your mother." Cassian looked strangely proud of that. Good. He should be. The days afterward grew easier. Training swords, garden walks, stories before bed when storms frightened the palace wolves, into restless pacing outside the West Wing. Kalor learned Cassian hated cold soup, loved climbing things he shouldn't, and asked impossible questions at the worst moments. "Did you ever think about us before we came back? What did Mother look like when she was younger? Why do kings always look tired?" No council negotiation ever exhausted Kalor faster than answering honestly. But he kept trying, because each conversation repaired something small between them. And for the first time in years, Kalor found himself leaving royal meetings early, simply to spend another hour with his son. The palace noticed. So did Lyra. One late afternoon, Kalor entered the western garden, carrying 2 wooden practice swords, only to stop short. Cassian slept beneath the large willow tree, with his head resting in Lyra's lap, while she quietly read beside him. Peaceful, safe. Kalor stood, watching silently longer than necessary. Lyra eventually noticed him. "You're staring. I'm observing." "That sounds more royal." He almost smiled. Almost. Kalor sat beside them slowly while the evening wind moved softly through the trees overhead. "He asked about you again earlier," Lyra said quietly. Kalor glanced toward Cassian, sleeping peacefully. "What did you tell him?" "The truth." That answer no longer frightened him the way it once did, because somewhere along the past weeks, Kalor realized Lyra never used honesty as punishment, only clarity. Cassian stirred slightly, then blinked awake slowly. The moment he noticed Kalor sitting beside them, his expression brightened automatically. No hesitation now, no uncertainty, just recognition. Father, he mumbled sleepily. Did you bring the swords? The word hit Kalor harder than battle cries ever had. Father. Natural. Unforced. Chosen freely. Kalor looked at his son carefully, for a long moment, before answering quietly. Yes. Cassian smiled immediately, before grabbing the practice swords excitedly and running toward the open garden path. Lyra watched him go silently, then glanced toward Kalor. He still looked stunned. You all right? She asked softly. Kalor exhaled slowly. No, he admitted. A pause. I think that was the first time he called me that willingly. Lyra's expression softened just slightly. And for once, neither of them looked away from the moment. Summer settled warmly across the palace gardens. For the first time in years, the royal grounds felt alive instead of guarded. Wolves rested openly beneath shaded trees, while servants crossed the pathways without lowering their heads in fear every time nobles passed. The kingdom had changed. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough that people finally noticed the difference. And standing at the center of most of it, whether she wanted the attention or not, was Lyra. Late one evening, Kalor found her near the western gardens, watching Cassian race through the grass beside two young wolves. The boy laughed loudly every time the smaller wolf tried stealing the wooden training sword from his hands. Lyra folded her arms lightly as she watched him. He runs like you, Kalor observed quietly while approaching beside her. Lyra glanced sideways. Unfortunately, he argues like you too. For the first time in years, Kalor laughed softly. A real one. Brief, but real. Cassian looked toward them instantly from across the garden. Father, he shouted excitedly. Watch this. Before Kalor could answer, the boy attempted jumping across the low fountain stones. He nearly slipped halfway through. Lyra closed her eyes briefly. Kalor sighed. Cassian somehow landed successfully anyway, and lifted both arms proudly afterward. I survived. That's not the standard we're aiming for, Lyra called back dryly. Cassian laughed harder. The wolves barked excitedly around him. Kalor watched the scene quietly. Then his expression slowly changed again. More serious now, more honest. I can punish everyone responsible, he said softly beside Lyra. I can rewrite laws, protect servants, restructure the court. Lyra stayed silent. Kalor looked toward his son again. But I can't return what you lost. The words settled heavily between them, because both of them knew exactly what he meant. First steps, first words, winter fevers, birthdays, nightmares, all the ordinary moments fathers were supposed to witness, gone forever. Lyra finally answered quietly. No, she said. You can't. Kalor lowered his gaze briefly. No anger remained in her voice anymore. That somehow hurt more, because anger implied expectation. This sounded like acceptance. A long silence followed, while evening sunlight softened across the gardens around them. Cassian suddenly ran toward them, breathless with excitement. Mother! Father! Look! One of the younger wolves trotted proudly beside him, carrying the stolen wooden sword in its mouth. Cassian grinned triumphantly. He finally brought it back. Kalor looked down at his son, smiling between them. Then, at Lyra standing beside him, after 7 years of absence, neither of them could erase. Not servants, not secrets, not political mistakes hidden inside palace walls. A family. Damaged, complicated, but real. Cassian grabbed both their hands instinctively before pulling them toward the fountain. Come on, he demanded happily. You're both too slow. Lyra looked mildly offended. Kalor almost laughed again. Almost. They followed anyway. And while watching his son race ahead through the gardens beneath the evening light, Kalor finally understood the cruelest part of regret. It wasn't losing something valuable. It was realizing too late how valuable it had always been. because the servant, he barely noticed, had carried away the entire future he should have protected from the beginning.